they face and the steps that they and their families take in mitigating these risks. And secondly, to inform our joint child protection programming across the Pacific Island countries into the future. So we want to acknowledge the contribution of our in-country staff in participating countries, and particularly for children, the young people, the parents, teachers, and the community leaders, all who participated very generously in this research. So in addition to our online launch today, the Australian launch, there'll be a Pacific launch that will be held in the coming weeks by our country teams. So the purpose of today's session really is for us to share the key findings of the report and to discuss what this means then for policymakers, for programming, and for financial investment into systems that will address violence against children and, of course, online violence against children. So we have 45 minutes and we're very eager to ensure that you, the participants, have time to be involved in the discussion. So Suzanne and I have prepared a number of questions, but we would invite you to ask questions during the session of Amanda. In fact, we warmly invite your questions, and then we'll follow in the question and answer, and we'll identify those questions and hope that we can cover them. But of course, there'll be time for us to follow up afterwards and with individual people and individual post the session. So I think with that, I'll hand back to you, Suzanne.
So I just want to mention, which I didn't in the beginning, is that we're recording this webinar. So just letting you know that for the purposes of a record of the webinar, it is being recorded. My first question, Amanda, is really around, you bring a global perspective on the question of children and their use of digital technology. Can you summarise the headline findings from this report for us?
Absolutely, Suzanne, and I'm going to just share my screen because I've put together one slide that just pulls together, I guess, the key areas that we investigated. So there you go. So we looked at 6 different areas, and I think before I launch into the key findings, I would just like to reiterate that while I'm presenting this work today, actually there's been an enormous collaborative effort behind the scenes to make this research happen. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow team members Girish Lala, Nukta Ogan and Lily Moody, all of whom worked to design and implement this piece of research, but also the massive support of Child Fund Australia, Child Fund in the region, as well as Plan International Australia and their regional offices, and the organisations and partners they pulled together to make this happen. So we've investigated these 6 key areas, all of which, there's more detail around this in the report that you can find online. So I'll just run through those quickly. We looked at access and digital ecology, and I guess one of the striking things that came out is that that at least 50% of children who participated in the research experience consistent challenges having reliable and quality access to digital technology and the internet. And that's especially the case for those from low income communities. And as such, this is a really key policy and advocacy priority for the region. The key constraints that children and their families face are financial. Families talked about not being able to afford data and devices. So too, though, poor quality connectivity, unreliable electricity infrastructure, etc. These are other sort of key major barriers. Where they have access, children tend to go online using a mobile device. So children in this region appear to be very much part of that mobile first generation. But this raises some questions about the quality of their online experiences today. Children are using digital technology for all kinds of things, and indeed technology is really infiltrating everyday life in the Pacific countries we worked in. And children are primarily using technology for entertainment, learning and communicating, primarily with friends, but also with parents and carers that they know face to face. And interestingly, children also talked about using technology for religious purposes, so accessing sermons, religious texts, and so on. Children, I think the access question is really critical when we're thinking about online safety, because those children who experience constraints on their ability, on their ability to access digital technology also experience constraints on their capacity to develop the relevant kinds of digital literacies that enable them to keep themselves safe online. So it's very clear that there's a dire need for digital literacy education and online safety training for children and also parents and carers in the region. In terms of the benefits and opportunities that children reported, echoing other studies that we've done internationally, children weren't always very clear about the opportunities afforded by digital technology. And there's clear scope to encourage them to explore technology and to enable them to think about how they might maximise the benefits of being online. And as part of that, I think it was very clear that we need to support children to develop the higher order technical and creative skills that we know are so important to being able to leverage the benefits of technology. So children see education and communication with others as the key benefits. And both children and parents really talked about how technology can strengthen family relationships, which was a really lovely finding of this study. But there is a generation gap around understanding the opportunities and benefits. It's clear that parents are not always attuned in the same ways that children are to the potential positives of using technology. So we can do some building of awareness in that respect. In terms of risks of harm, children and parents and carers, as well as all of the other stakeholders that we worked with across sectors, are primarily worried about children encountering inappropriate content online, whether that be violent content or pornography and so on. And after inappropriate content, the secondary concerns are around cyberbullying and privacy risks such as hacking. And they're worried in particular about social media. Participants also recognise, however, that risks of harm don't only materialise online, but they spill over between online and offline spaces, meaning that it's super important that online safety initiatives align with other initiatives to reduce harm or protect children in offline settings. There was also a bit of tension around the ways that children's technology use might be undermining cultural values, established cultural values, and also parental authority. And so I think we have a little bit of work to do there around sort of thinking about how to minimise parents' concerns and really enable them to take a strengths-based approach to supporting their children to be online and to be safe in doing so. But there is really a significant opportunity to build children's awareness of the risks and to skill them and their families to manage those risks appropriately. But this has to be really done very, very carefully. I think a sole focus on the risks could be very, very detrimental. We also have to teach children and their families at the same time about how they might use technology for good. In terms of resilience and protective skills, children use a combination of behavioural strategies and technical strategies to protect their safety online, but their current strengths, if you like, lie in the behavioural ones. They talked about things like how their religious values really shaped the choices they made in online settings. They talked about how they tried to exercise self-restraint, follow guidance from parents and carers, not accepting friend requests from strangers, and so on. So using a lot of behavioural strategies to shore up their safety online. And there's clear scope, both to strengthen those practices, but also to really enhance children's technical skills in the region. So I guess one of the key things to take away from the report is that online safety education needs to be framed around the development of children's technical capacities, and their knowledge of privacy in particular. Things like setting up security, managing security settings, using passwords, firewalls, and other technical protections. In terms of mediation and support, children are primarily turning to parents for help. But this is a wonderful thing on the one hand, because the family obviously provides a really important context for supporting children to be safe online. But the challenge is that parents themselves do not feel well equipped to support their children's online safety. So there's really, there's two things we can do here. We can raise children's awareness of other avenues of support or help when it's needed. But we also need to focus very, very hard on building parents' digital literacy so that they are in a better position to support their children. At the moment, what we're seeing is that parents in the region tend to use restrictive strategies when it comes to managing their children's digital practices. So they put a lot of rules in place, which they then find difficult to enforce. And around 15% of the sample we worked with prohibit technology altogether. And there are some gender implications there. It's not always seen as appropriate for girls to be engaging with technology, and we need to put some energy there too. Lastly, responsibility. Children see parents and carers as having an enormous responsibility for helping to ensure their online safety, but also law enforcement, schools, teachers, and other decision makers and government representatives. Adult stakeholders that we engaged with, and also parents and carers in the three countries, are calling on the governments of their nations to develop and put into practice legislation, policies and regulation to assure the safety of children online. And they're also calling for online safety and digital literacy more broadly to be embedded in the national education curriculum. And I think in terms of responsibility, children didn't always note that they themselves are responsible for keeping themselves online. So there might be a bit of work there to raise their own understanding of what they can do and empower them to achieve that. But I think there's an enormous opportunity also to involve children more actively in relation to sort of decision making around child online safety policy and programming.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Some really interesting headline findings there. Can I just remind people that and invite you to put any questions on the Q&A that you have for Amanda. A number of things raised there. But then following on from your last point, Amanda, can you talk to us about who is responsible for children's safety online?
Yes, thanks, Margaret. It was very clear talking to adult stakeholders from across the NGO, corporate and government sectors that there's a keen understanding that there is a shared responsibility. And indeed, looking at interventions around the world, we know that online safety is best supported by a whole of community approach. We really need to work hard to develop ecosystems that can deliver protection for children online, and that ranges from regulatory and sort of legislative contexts right down to how people interact personally. There's a I think it's really important to bring the socio-ecological model into play when we're thinking about responsibility. And certainly, children, as I said, have really outlined that parents have a big responsibility, so we need to skill parents and build their capacities there. But I think increasingly, responsibility from government is critical, and not just government inside the region, if you like, so not individual. I mean, Solomon Islands government, Papua New Guinea government, and the Kiribati government certainly are taking responsibility and are already doing lots of wonderful things. But I think there's real opportunity, given the Australian government's funding of the new infrastructure that's about to be switched on, that there's a responsibility for us to also invest in children's online safety as well. And indeed, there's a lot of expertise here in Australia that will be really useful to the region as things unfold.
Amanda, I'm really interested in the findings in relation to boys and girls. Did you find a difference between, any differences between both how the boys and girls themselves perceived the use of online technology, or how their parents perceived the difference based on that?
Yes, yes. And Suzanne, I'd highlight that this is an area that we probably need to do a lot more work in, because we did indeed identify some differences, and I think there's a lot more to unpack there. I think access is kind of stratified according to gender, it seems, to some degree, in the sense that there are cultural attitudes around whether or not it's appropriate for girls to use technology to the same degree that boys might use technology. So definitely there are some it would be good to see some intervention around empowering girls to take hold of technology. I think also, but that's not a simple question of telling girls they can take up the opportunity of technology. Of course, as many of the people on this call will already understand, there are lots of constraints on girls' mobility and their access to financial resources and so on. So what we did also uncover is that girls are sometimes taking on other responsibilities, whether they're family or school responsibilities and so on, that sort of limit or restrict their capacity to access technology. So we need to think about that very holistically. But I think concerningly, for me, and I guess thinking about the fact that we know that there are sort of strong, there is a problem with gender-based violence in the region, and PLAN's work in that field has been really important. Is that for girls and boys, there was a very clear perception that girls are way more vulnerable than boys online. And perhaps what we might think of as quite problematic ideas about the girls being unable to defend themselves adequately. They're likely to be more emotional and not as strong, and these kinds of things. And at the same time, boys were stereotyped as typically being the offenders online. So there's some very, very stark gender assumptions at play there around who's most at risk online. I do think we need to take that very seriously, though, in the sense that I think given the rates of violence that children experience in the region, and particularly girls, there's a very real possibility that actually technology can, escalate or exacerbate those forms of violence or compound them. So we've got to be very careful to watch closely as this technology gets taken up more widely, and to really work in existing programs that are there to reduce gender-based violence, to begin to embed the digital in those programs, and also to really address the gender factors through any online safety or digital literacy training that might be delivered. So yeah, I think there's a lot more to say about the gender, but those would be the sort of headline thoughts.
Thank you. A number of questions have come in now. So perhaps if I could pose a few that might be able to be answered reasonably quickly. But so one is about the age of the children and young people surveyed, as in the specific ages. So Priscilla from Cyber Safety Pacifica is interested in that. Also a question about the role, was the research able to tell us anything about the role that schools currently play? And the third one, were there any distinctive differences across the countries in the safety issues that children and young people identified? So if I could perhaps ask those three, Amanda.
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, in terms of the method itself, we worked with children aged 8 to 18. So we had a very broad cross-section of developmental stages, I guess. But just to clarify, we didn't survey children. We used a workshop-based method in order to work very closely with children to engage them using creative and participatory methods to really try and dig down and get a granular understanding of their online practices. So we did everything from kind of ask them to draw maps of their communities and where people use technology, to writing letters to representatives of government to ask them, to tell government what they would like to see them do. And what we've found in the past is that this is a really wonderful way of actually understanding the fabric of children's experiences. In terms of what schools are already doing, so I think schools are trying very hard, but it's also very clear that there's not a lot of technology in schools. And that in a sense, the mobile phone being the key way that children engage, schools I don't think have a lot of oversight of technology use. So I think it's really important that that as we look to think about what children need, that we do consider programs that put technologies in schools, that support educators to really integrate technology into the curriculum, and that we skill teachers and school leadership to really understand what it is children like to do online and why, what the opportunities might be, but also what the potential risks of harm are, and what schools might be able to do. I think there are enormous learnings from around the world on programs that have worked effectively in schools. But of course, you can't just pick up a program and drop it into a new setting. It has to be very closely reworked and tailored to meet the particular cultural contexts of the environments that children are learning in. And in terms of country differences, this is a difficult one to summarise, because there were country differences, because we know, of course, that the Pacific, despite the fact that we put the blue continent and all of its component parts into one category, is an incredibly diverse region, so there were some differences. So, for example, children in the Solomon Islands were much more likely to identify using technology for religious purposes than children in the other two countries we worked in, which were Kiribati and Papua New Guinea. But also, I think at the end of the day, the commonalities across those three settings were very, very strong. And we've really sought to highlight those and draw those out in the recommendations that we've made. But what I would do is, I'm very hesitant about reducing the differences in a sort of a sweeping statement. So what I might do there is actually refer people to the appendix at the back of the report, which highlights all of the key country differences. Just reiterating that actually the commonalities were pretty strong, which indicates actually there's a lot of scope for Pacific nations to be collaborating with one another to share resources and thinking and to prompt and provoke each other as they embark on this journey of ensuring children can be safe online.
Thanks very much, Amanda. There are a few more questions that have come in. I think some of the methodology questions were really picked up before, or perhaps people could go back and look at the report for that. There's a question going back to kind of the responsibility and who's responsible. There's a specific question saying, what's the responsibility for tech, social media, and kind of mobile companies? Where do you see their responsibility sitting?
Clearly, there's a role for these players in the field, and I think there's been a lot of work behind the scenes. I think it's not always obvious to the external audience, but a lot of these technology companies are thinking very hard about what to do, how to protect children online, and indeed there are a lot of really good minds working on those questions. Without a doubt, technology companies have a role to play. I think, particularly given that these are phenomena, if you like, these digital technologies potentially can have a kind of homogenizing effect. They can, treat all the different settings they roll out into as if they are equal, right? You know, so and there's a real need to pay attention to cultural specificity and to think about how technology might be picked up in really creative and inventive ways in particular places in the region. And in a sense, you know, reworking how we think about technology. So without a doubt, there is a key responsibility there. But I also think that, you know, we need to, that it is not a matter of pointing the finger at any particular person in the or entity in the ecology. It is a matter of a whole of community approach. We have to get much, much better at working across those divides between sectors, harnessing resources, not reinventing the wheel, not duplicating, maximising the efficiency of our investments, all of those kinds of things. This is just super critical going forward.
Thanks, Amanda. And perhaps there are two questions that have come in that I could link together. So one of the questions was, are there key groups of children that are really locked out of the digital world in the Pacific? And I suppose in a way you've already identified that gender is an issue. So for some girls, they're locked out. And that also some children are restricted by their parents. And then earlier there was the reference to poverty and that poor children haven't even got access to technology. But then, so any other groups that you see perhaps locked out, but then there's a question and saying, is there anything that perhaps you could see or strategies that came out that might be possible to help parents move beyond these restrictive strategies? So if you could address perhaps any groups that are locked out, and then potential restrictive strategies to address with parents. Thanks.
Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, absolutely. These are fantastic questions. The inclusion questions are a really critical one. And so in addition to the groups that you've just reiterated, Margaret, I think geography plays an enormous role in all of this. It was clear that children living in the outer reaches of these island nations are simply not having access to technology in the same kinds of ways. And, you know, I think if we're not really careful to address that access question, we really risk you know, deepening some of those existing inequities. So we really need to work hard on that. But at the same time, geography plays out quite differently too. I mean, geography within particular cities is also a real issue. So when we worked, for example, with children in the settlements outside Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, it became very evident that, you know, they had very limited, almost fleeting engagement with digital technology, and that, you know, they that in a sense they are missing out. Interestingly, in those places, I think technology tends to be, you know, it tends to be the adult in the family, usually the father, who owns a mobile phone, and the mobile phone gets handed to the children when the parents want a break. So these children pick up the mobile phone and watch, you know, video streaming platforms and so on, relatively unsupervised, you know, and I don't mean to grossly generalize there, but we did see that happening a lot in that particular community. And so I think there, you know, there's actually enabling families to access affordable plans, affordable devices, and reliable connectivity, reliable electricity is going to be really critical if we're to overcome those divides. In terms of parents and their strategy or strategies we might deploy to move them beyond their tendency to restrict children's practices, I think one of the key things here is really building parents and carers' understanding of what digital technology is, how it works, because these restrictive practices tend to be motivated by fear and a lack of understanding, a lack of experience with the digital technology itself. So I think, you know, and this is not just a matter of educating parents about these things. I think, you know, parents have to also be given opportunities to explore technology and really you know, unpack it for themselves so that they're in a position to assess more realistically whether or not their children are at risk. But I think one of the things that we identified in the report is that for a lot of the, for actually many children, but also for some of their parents and carers, there aren't really ways, culturally appropriate ways of explaining what the internet is, how it works and who it exposes you to, and therefore ways of mitigating the risks. So I think a really key thing would be to kind of begin to think about, well, what are the cultural metaphors that we might mobilize to help people really get an understanding of that. So, you know, in the Solomons, for example, the Wantok system might be a good metaphor for thinking about how, you know, how to communicate how the internet works, because it works on some of the same principles of reciprocity and respect and so on, obligation, etc. Yeah, so I think sort of finding some culturally appropriate metaphors, investing in parents' own technology use, so the uptake of technology, whether that's through investment in business programs or you know, programs to enable very affordable access to devices for families. But then also the education piece is absolutely fundamental, and that's where I'm very excited about the next stage of work being undertaken by Plan International Australia and Child Fund Australia around developing those resources, because parents, not only did we identify that they need it, they are calling out for this. They are desperate to understand how all of this works. They can see that it might be good for their children, it might open up education. In particular, they understand the education as a big opportunity. But they are, I can't emphasize that strongly enough. They're really calling for that education piece.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm looking here, there's one, perhaps a quick one, but someone, I think colleagues from Plan were noting that prior research had identified that adults and youth had a concern about access to pornography online, and we're wondering whether or not the study also showed this.
So there was definitely, the research definitely showed there is a concern about pornography, and it's a concern more so in some places than others. So in particular, this was one of the key country differences, if you like. Pornography was seen to be a real issue, in particular in Papua New Guinea, which is not to say it wasn't also an issue elsewhere, but Papua New Guinea was seen to be a real problem. And I think that you know, that articulates with concerns around gender attitudes in communities. You know, parents are worried in particular about their girls and how the internet might be teaching young men unhealthy attitudes towards sex and you know, bodies and so on. So I think, yeah, definitely pornography was voiced as a key concern. We don't actually have prevalence data, so we don't know how many children are accessing pornography online. You know, that research is yet to be done, and I think we do need to do that research fairly urgently, because I think we need to arm governments, the NGO sector and the technology providers with the information they need in order to address people's concerns appropriately. Yes. I'll stop there, Margaret, because you did ask me for a short answer.
Okay, no, that was good. And there are a number of other questions coming in. I'm trying to kind of pull them together, and so I hopefully we'll get to your question. There are a number of questions that have come up really around, I think, legislation and restriction and what the role or responsibility of the Australian government is on ensuring that, you know, say in design, that things are built in. So can you perhaps talk a little bit more about that responsibility for the Australian government maybe to put on providers?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's definitely a role for governments in you know, in helping to create the right contexts for online safety in the region. And I think too, the Australian government has got enormous expertise to share with the region here, and so are potentially a really wonderful and valuable resource. And I would flag the work of the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner in Australia, who obviously have been working very, very hard to think through some of the complexities of the issues relating to online safety here in Australia, but have also already been liaising with countries in the region to support them as the new underwater cable is turned on. And I think, you know, one of the wonderful innovations of that office is, in fact, the safety by design orientation, if you like, whereby that office has put together a series of guidelines or principles that can be picked up by technology providers, ranging from the very, very small organisations right up to the larger organisations, to ensure that as they build technologies, whether they're technologies that are designed specifically for children or technologies that are designed for more generic audiences, that children's safety is embedded in those platforms and products. And I think this is a really major innovation. And I think what I'm really encouraged by is that I am seeing a lot of technology providers really taking that challenge very, very seriously. I mean, I think we're seeing some really good progress there. And so, yeah, so it's that kind of, I guess, governments need to set those standards, and then they need to facilitate the contexts in which we can all work together to achieve these goals. I think that, as I said earlier, technology providers clearly have a very important role to play here.
Thanks, Amanda. One of the questions, in fact, I can answer quite quickly. There was a question about SwipeSafe from Shona about whether or not this could be adapted. So it's a program that's been developed and being used in Vietnam. And I think that the research indeed was developed to see how SwipeSafe might be able to be contextualized in different settings. So I think what will happen in that next phase is looking at what we found out about the similarities or differences in Pacific countries, how that might be adapted, and how we can look at implementing different programs or expanding that. I think learning from gender differences and some of the things that may not have been considered earlier, or that in fact we can do better. But one that I'm very keen for you to address, Amanda, is that there's a question here that what were some of the strongest messages that young people themselves wanted to communicate to others about their experiences online?
Oh, thank you to the person who asked that question. It's such an important question, and I think what we've really tried to do is to create a lot of space in the report for children's views on what they want, what they need, and what they aspire to really shine through. And so I hope that you'll look at the report and really take what they have to say on board, because they were genius. But I think they're calling for all kinds of things. I think though, quite predictably, they're calling for more access. Kids always want to, have more access to the technology and less rules and so on. They're excited about the opportunities of digital technology. They see this as something interesting, and the majority of them are really enthusiastic about how they might use technology either now or into their futures. So I think there's a huge level of excitement there. But they're also quite level-headed when you give them an opportunity to think through the issues. And I think this really underscores the need to make spaces for children to ask questions and to explore the issues in depth. Because when they do, what they say is also, well, I do need rules. I need my parents to say that's enough, or I need my school teacher to say put your phone away, or whatever. They recognise that they do need rules. So even though they're very enthusiastic and say on the one hand they want to use technology more, they also recognise that it's a question of balance. They're really calling on governments to ensure that they can access technology in schools. I think they'd like the opportunity to really explore how technology might support their learning. They're calling for parents and carers to really acknowledge how I guess, important their communication is via digital technology with their peers. And you know, this is a common refrain, not just in the region, but around the world, is that children do tend to feel that their enthusiasm for communicating via digital technology with their friends and the value of that for strengthening and sustaining those very everyday face-to-face relationships is really underappreciated by the adults all around them, whether it be their parents and carers or their teachers and so on. So I think they're really calling for that.
Thank you very much for that, Amanda. We do have to keep moving. I'm wondering now if you could think about moving forward, and as I said, part of the research was so that it can help inform future programs and approaches. So what key recommendations from the report would you see as being the most important as we go forward with children's safety online? Maybe you could highlight some for...
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think very, very quickly, because I do realise we're running out of time, I think as we move forward, some of the most critical recommendations are around continuing to engage children, parents and carers, as well as other stakeholders with an interest in these issues in the ongoing conversation about what's happening on the ground, because it will require a whole of community approach. And it's very, very important that we keep the cultural context very firmly in the frame. So we need to really practice user-centered design and implementation. I think, and I guess, you know, aside from sort of that whole of community approach and being really sensitive to the cultural issues, the other really key thing, or two other key things, I think thinking about building the capacities of the adults in children's lives is a critical focus. And I think also that point around working across online and offline spaces, because the challenges that children face are not solely online, they spill over into these other settings, and we need to really think holistically as we approach the question of online safety. Those would be, I think, some of the key things we should really hold tightly as we move forward.
Thanks very much, Amanda. I think we're back over to Suzanne for either some closing comments, or please, Suzanne, feel free if there were other questions there that you really would like us to pick up. I've been trying to pull them together, but either of those,
I think there's one question I really do want to ask you about, which is just about the COVID-19 environment and whether this emerged at all. But some of the concerns, one of the questions relates to the role that parents might play actually in facilitating online sexual abuse of their children, especially given the kind of context, and how digital technologies could facilitate that. I mean, did that emerge in the research? Is that a concern for you? How is that presented in the research? Because I think this is a really big issue and something we have had to learn from other places in the region.
Absolutely. So just to be clear, we did our data collection before COVID-19 happened. So we didn't have an opportunity to reflect on that, but we will shortly do another phase of this research in Fiji, and we hope to pick up some of those questions then. But the point that you raise around parents facilitating online child sexual exploitation is a really, really important one, because we do know, if not from the Pacific setting, from other settings around the world, that that this is a serious risk and one that requires very specialised intervention. The problem is, though, continually being able to identify those perpetrators, if you like, and to really work to mitigate that. I think there's a lot of potential for us to work with platforms to identify really clever ways to use what we might think of as passive data collection to and to think creatively about how we might use that data to intervene before things escalate. But it is a critical question, and one that requires dedicated investment and energy.
Margaret, do you have any reflective comments from just listening to that response from Amanda around a whole range of issues? Key takeaways for you?
Okay, so a couple of the key takeaways for me are that I think the whole balance, I think that the report has some very interesting information for us around the balance between access, opportunity, and the importance of online opportunity versus the negative language of fear. And I think that I believe that the research has a lot to offer us here. I mean, we need to be very careful that language of fear and that the online environment is a bad environment for young people would be really very negative, because we can see all of the opportunities. And I think us and reports like this need to put it in that context so that people can go back and in a very informed way say, no, these are the benefits. And the other one that I would say is that, of course, the legislative environment that a number of people have talked about, that we can't underestimate that and make sure that everyone is responsible for this. So yes, young people have to take some responsibility themselves, but governments and businesses that are developing these apps, there's huge responsibility, and maybe there's more role for legislation in that area. And finally, that we should never forget these geographic imbalances. And I'm reminded when we look at these reports, and of course we want to look at what we learn, but the other thing it tells us is that young people in really remote areas have less access from the beginning. Okay, maybe they're not as exposed to dangers, but if they're not part of the dialogue, so we need to look for ways that those young people who have less access, whether it be girls or the poorest, that they're involved in the whole discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. My key takeaway, I guess, is from our lessons actually around ending violence against children, the need for that sort of social ecology or ecosystem approach, that we can't be just intervening in one place. We need to be intervening across with parents, with caregivers, with children. We need to be bringing that kind of youth-led and gender-responsive approach. But that's kind of, we've learned that lesson from our child protection work in the region more generally. I think what I've taken away is we need to bring that into the digital space as well and apply those lessons that we have from the offline environment, and we have to, extend them into that online environment. I really want to say thank you on behalf of Plan International, Australia and Child Fund Australia. Professor Third, this is really amazing research, really, because it's filling that evidence gap and it's giving us something to kind of hang on to. It shows how much more we need to know, but I think that's a really positive thing in a way. Thank you for your insights, for the fantastic research. We'd like to thank the ANC program and DFAT for funding this work. And Margaret and I would also just really like to thank all of you for coming and for your engagement, the fantastic questions. They give us a lot of food for thought, and I think it's indicated to me that there's a lot of interest across the board in this particular issue, and I think we might need to consider, how do we keep this discussion and dialogue alive amongst a whole lot of people, because the answers don't sit in one place or another, they sit across the intelligence and the wisdom in this group. So thank you very much. We're going to close the session now and say thank you very much for being with us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.